Just a few months ago, Canada signed a new security and defence partnership with the European Union.
As the Prime Minister mentioned, Europe is a key market for Canadian trade diversification.
Canada is bolstering its security cooperation with Europe against the backdrop of an increasingly destabilized Middle East.
Canada's exports to non-US markets surged 24.8% in March 2025, the second largest increase in recorded history. At the same time, exports to US declined 6.6%, largest drop since height of pandemic in 2020. Canada exported $34 billion to EU in 2024, a 57% increase from 2015.
I wanted to start off on something that a lot of Canadians are thinking about right now because of the trade war we are engaged in with the United States and sort of the new fiscal policy involving tariffs with the U.S. We are very concretely, and the federal government has expressed this on numerous occasions, looking to diversify.
Bilateral trade increased over 65% compared to pre-CETA levels. Share of Canadian exports to U.S. slipped below 70%, first time in decades. This isn't a new deal. It's the Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, that's been provisionally enforced since September 2017. But December 2025, Trump's tariffs are forcing Canadian exporters to actually use it, and America is watching its biggest trading partner pivot to Europe. I'm going to break down how CETA eliminates 99% of tariffs to Europe, why Trump's trade war is accelerating Canadian diversification, what sectors are shifting billions in exports from America to EU, how Prime Minister Carney pledged to double non-US exports by 2035, and why Washington is panicking as Canada builds economic ties that cut out the United States. Subscribe to this channel right now if you want to understand how America is losing its economic grip on Canada. Let's start with CETA. Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement between Canada and European Union entered provisional application September 21, 2017. Agreement eliminates duties on 99% of all tariff lines, 98% scrapped when it provisionally entered into force. Before CETA, only 25% of Canadian products exported to EU were duty-free. Tariffs were as high as 25%. 99% of tariffs eliminated, giving Canadian exporters preferential access to 450 million consumers in one of the world's largest economies. And for 8 years, most Canadian companies ignored it because selling to America was easier. Despite more expansive free trade network than any other G7 country offering access to 2/3 of global economy, 70% of Canadian exports remained concentrated in US as of 2024. Only 4% directed to CETA markets and 8% to CPTPP countries, 70% to America, 4% to Europe. Canada had the tools to diversify, just never used them. Because why bother when US market was stable, predictable, and profitable? Then Trump changed everything. February 2025, Trump imposed 25% tariff on virtually all Canadian goods. March 2025, exports to US fell 6.6%, costing numerous industries billions in lost revenue. Crude oil exports down 8%, machinery down 7.3%, auto parts down 12%. A 12% drop in auto parts, 8% drop in crude oil, 7.3% drop in machinery, billions in lost sales. And Canadian exporters finally realized, we need Europe. March 2025, Canada's merchandise exports to non-US countries surged 24.8% month over month. European Union was main beneficiary, Canadian exports rising 24.8% in March over previous month. 24.8% surge to Europe in 1 month. That's not gradual diversification, that's panic pivoting. Canadian companies frantically searching for buyers who aren't subject to Trump's tariffs. Canada's merchandise exports to EU grew by just over $5 billion as of September 2025 compared to same period last year, increase of over 20%. Oil exports led the way, but canola seed exports increased more than tenfold. Canola exports tenfold. Because China imposed 100% tariffs on Canadian canola, so producers shipped to Europe instead under CETA's zero tariff access. Since CETA's provisional application in 2017, trade in goods grew 65% and services by 90%, overall increase of 72% from 2016 to 2024. CETA has eliminated tariffs on 94% of Canadian food products, giving boost to agri-food market, 65% growth in goods, 90% growth in services. And that was before Trump's tariffs forced Canadian exporters to take CETA seriously. Export Development Canada sectors like zinc, sugar, and cereals have seen CETA utilization rates near 100%. EU tariffs on frozen lobster and frozen crab removed under CETA, benefiting seafood exporters. Zinc, sugar, cereals, seafood. 100% utilization of CETA preferences, because European buyers pay zero tariffs on Canadian products while American buyers face uncertainty, delays, and Trump's chaotic trade policy. June 2025, Prime Minister Mark Carney and EU leaders agreed to deepen cooperation and partnership at 20th EU-Canada Summit. Joint statement committed to launching work towards digital trade agreement that would complement CETA. Digital trade agreement, expanding CETA. While America imposes tariffs, Canada and EU are deepening economic integration with new digital commerce framework. Canada committed to doubling exports to non-US markets by 2035. Prime Minister Carney pledged to reduce Canada's economic reliance on United States. Double non-US exports by 2035. That's official Canadian government policy. Carney isn't trying to maintain the US relationship. He's trying to end Canada's dependence on it. Export Development Canada Regional VP for Europe, Bruce Dunlop. We've been flooded with calls from companies looking for help entering new markets. Canadian companies have realized that diversifying their export markets is no longer just nice to have, it's essential to survive and thrive. Essential to survive. Export Development Canada, the federal export credit agency, getting flooded with requests for European market access, because Trump made selling to America too risky. Under CETA, 99% of EU tariff lines are duty-free for Canadian goods, compared to 25% in pre-CETA era. Agreement establishes clear and favorable rules of origin, ensuring products with Canadian inputs recognized as originating from Canada, 99% duty-free access, rules of origin that protect Canadian content. Meanwhile, America is threatening to withdraw from USMCA entirely. Canadian service companies no longer have to maintain representative office in EU to supply services to EU customers, especially helpful for smaller companies lacking resources to establish permanent offices overseas. Small Canadian companies can serve European customers without European offices, lower barriers, easier access. While America raises barriers and creates uncertainty, here's the political dimension. Currently, 17 of 27 EU member states completed national ratification processes for CETA. 10 still need to ratify: Belgium, Bulgaria, Cyprus, France, Greece, Hungary, Ireland, Italy, Poland, and Slovenia. Only 17 of 27 ratified, including France, Canada's largest EU trading partner, which rejected CETA in March 2024. Yet the agreement still works because it's provisionally applied. France, Ireland, and Italy, some EU member states with which Canada has highest valued merchandise trade and services trade, have not yet ratified CETA. France, Ireland, Italy, major trading partners, haven't ratified, but CETA keeps working because provisional application covers 99% of the agreement. Agreement won't take full effect until all EU member states ratify, but substantial parts provisionally applied from September 21, 2017. 8 years of provisional application, and it's still not fully ratified. But Canadian exporters don't care because they're getting the benefits now. Now let's look at specific sectors. 2024. Canada exported $34 billion to EU, 57% increase from pre-CETA trade in 2015. Most significant increases occurred in 2021 and 2022. Exports growing +9.35% and +9.66%, imports by +12.67% and +18.39%. $34 billion to Europe, up 57% since CETA, and that was before Trump's tariffs forced the real pivot. From 2018-2024, most Canadian provinces increased exports to EU despite pandemic dip in 2020. Ontario, Quebec, and Saskatchewan saw strongest export growth, with Ontario and Quebec consistently leading all provinces. Ontario and Quebec, Canada's industrial heartland, shifting exports to Europe. Auto parts, machinery, pharmaceuticals, products that used to go to Michigan and Ohio now shipping to Germany and France. Total merchandise trade to nations other than US hit $47.6 billion in May 2025, third consecutive all-time high. Higher shipments of crude oil to Singapore, unwrought aluminum to Italy, pharmaceuticals to Italy, crude oil to Singapore, aluminum to Italy, pharmaceuticals across Europe. Canadian exporters finding buyers everywhere except America. Exports to ASEAN countries increased 11.2%. Southeast Asia becoming crucial growth market. Thailand grown in importance. Canadian agri-food exports up 23%. Clean tech components up 16%. Thailand, ASEAN, Indo-Pacific. Canada building trading relationships across the globe while America fights tariff wars. Value of petroleum exports to China grew by more than 240% in first 3 quarters of 2025 compared to same period last year. After Trans Mountain pipeline expansion came online May 2024, Canadian crude exports to China began to soar, especially as China moved away from U.S. oil. 240% increase in oil exports to China. Trans Mountain pipeline allowing Canadian crude to reach Asian markets, while America assumed Canada would always sell oil to them. Trans Mountain talked about expanding by another 400,000 barrels per day. Memorandum of Understanding between Alberta and Canada contemplates West Coast Pipeline with potentially million additional barrels per day capacity. Another million barrels per day to Asia. Canada building infrastructure to permanently redirect oil exports away from United States. Here's what makes Washington panic. Budget 2025. $5 billion over 6 years for Strategic Response Fund. New program to help firms impacted by tariffs adapt, diversify, and grow. Program will offset new market access costs, support retooling, help Canada-based firms expand or secure new markets. $500 billion federal fund, specifically designed to help Canadian companies stop selling to America. Grants for market diversification, subsidies for retooling production for European standards. Government-funded pivot away from U.S. up to $1 billion over 3 years to regional development agencies for regional tariff response initiative to support businesses impacted. Another $1 billion regional support, making sure companies in every province can access European, Asian, and Latin American markets instead of relying on U.S. Government will focus efforts on Indo-Pacific, pivotal source of long-term demand, and Europe, where businesses can take advantage of established export links, similar business culture, shared geopolitical interests. Similar business culture, shared geopolitical interests. Canada officially describing Europe as more compatible partner than United States. That's diplomatic language for we don't trust America anymore. Canada-UK trade valued at $61 billion in 2024. UK is Canada's third largest trading partner for goods and services. Fast forward to 2025, this opened door to 450 million affluent consumers getting fresh attention from Canadian companies looking to diversify in face of growing market uncertainty. UK, $61 billion. Europe, $34 billion. Combine nearly $100 billion in trade with partners who aren't threatening tariffs every week. Beyond nearly tariff-free access under CETA and Canada-UK trade agreement, European markets offer advantages like stable regulatory regimes, strong adherence to rule of law and familiar business practices. Europe and Canada share core values, commitments to combating climate change, protecting human rights, promoting diversity, stable regulatory regimes, rule of law, shared values. Everything America used to represent before Trump. Here's the infrastructure challenge. Ports in Canada finding it difficult to manage surge in shipments to Asia and Europe. Port of Montreal currently runs at only 65% container ship capacity compared to fully automated ports in Europe like Rotterdam. Port capacity at 65% because Canada's physical infrastructure was built for north-south trade with America, not east-west trade with Europe and Asia. Provincial grids under stress as manufacturing increases to satisfy new export demands. Manitoba Hydro warned more mineral processing for exports could overwhelm system by mid-2025. Electrical grids maxed out, processing capacity strained. Because Canadian industry is shifting production to serve European and Asian markets instead of American. Canada's export profile shifted back to staples economy led by oil and gas exports. Higher value-added sectors comprised 55% of merchandise exports in 1999, but only 36% in 2025, while primary sectors were 38% in 1999 and 55% in 2025. Canada becoming resource exporter again, shipping raw materials to Europe and Asia, instead of manufacturing finished goods for America. That's de-industrialization driven by Trump's tariffs. Bigger challenge for Canada is to develop comprehensive economic strategy that adds value to resources through advanced manufacturing and technology. Canada's response so far has been to double down on oil and gas and mining. Doubling down on resources, abandoning advanced manufacturing. Because European and Asian buyers want Canadian commodities, not Canadian finished products. Here's the geopolitical shift. EU GDP benefits by $3.2 billion annually due to CETA. FDI stocks in 2023, $242.9 billion from EU to Canada and $249.5 billion from Canada to EU, $250 billion in cross-investment. Canada and Europe building permanent economic ties, while America burns bridges with tariff threats. CETA includes provisions on eliminating 99% of tariffs, establishing favorable rules of origin, easing customs and trade facilitation, increasing regulatory cooperation, accommodating trade in services and labor mobility. Labor mobility. Canadians can work in Europe, Europeans can work in Canada, building people-to-people ties that make economic integration irreversible. Agreement provides framework for professional orders and organizations in both markets to work out qualification equivalencies. Makes it easier for all parties to accept standards and certifications. Professional credentials recognized across Atlantic. Canadian engineers working in Germany, European doctors practicing in Toronto, creating integrated labor market that excludes United States. Renegotiation of USMCA will be pivotal for Canada's prospects in 2026 and beyond. Current baseline forecast assumes most U.S. tariffs on Canada will be removed by third quarter 2026. USMCA renegotiation in 2026. But Canadian exporters aren't waiting. They're building European and Asian supply chains now. Because even if Trump removes tariffs, trust is gone. Revamped USMCA clearly demonstrated its value, helping shield most North American trade from Trump's volatile tariff actions. If US threatens to withdraw or actually walks away, Canada and Mexico would face another major trade shock. Trump could withdraw from USMCA, kill North American free trade entirely. That's why Canada needs Europe as insurance policy. Here's what American businesses are losing. Economists refer to ensuing trade tensions as forced diversification, compelling Canadian exporters to investigate markets they previously disregarded. Forced diversification. American tariffs, forcing Canadian companies to find better partners. And once those relationships are built, they're permanent. Over past 4 months, exports to non-US markets ramped up to over 30%, level never achieved outside trade distortions during early pandemic. Even stripping out gold exports to UK, modest increased exports to places like EU and Japan helped Canada slowly diversify away from US 30% of exports going to non-US markets, highest ever outside pandemic chaos, and it's accelerating. Share of Canadian exports to US slipped below 70%. Below 70%. For decades, it was 75 to 80%, now falling fast. And every percentage point represents billions in American purchases lost to European and Asian competitors. Here's the bottom line. CETA has been provisionally in force since September 2017, eliminating 99% of EU tariffs on Canadian goods. For 8 years, Canadian exporters mostly ignored it because selling to America was easier. Trump's tariffs changed everything. February 2025. 25% tariffs on Canadian goods. March 2025, Canadian exports to US fell 6.6%, while exports to non-US markets surged 24.8%, second largest increase in recorded history. Canada exported $34 billion to EU in 2024, up 57% from 2015. Bilateral trade increased 65% under CETA. Sectors like zinc, sugar, cereals, seafood seeing 100% CETA utilization. Ontario and Quebec shifting industrial exports from America to Europe. Prime Minister Carney pledged to double non-US exports by 2035, official government policy to reduce dependence on United States. $5 billion strategic response fund helping companies diversify away from American markets. Canadian crude oil exports to China up to 40% after Trans Mountain expansion. Plans for another 1 million barrels per day pipeline capacity to Asian markets. Canola exports to Europe increased tenfold after China imposed 100% tariffs. Share of Canadian exports to US fell below 70%, lowest in decades. Exports to non-US markets hit 30%, highest ever outside pandemic. Trade to Europe, UK, Asia, Latin America all at record highs. June 2025 Summit. Canada and EU committed to digital trade agreement complementing CETA. Expanding economic integration, building permanent regulatory cooperation, creating integrated labor markets. $250 billion in cross-investment between Canada and EU. Professional credentials recognized across Atlantic. Service companies operating without European offices. Trade barriers eliminated while America raises them. America's biggest trading partner is pivoting to Europe. Not because Canada wants to, because Trump's tariffs forced it. And once Canadian companies build European supply chains, they're not coming back. This story will reshape North American trade for generations. Stay tuned.